You're listening to What Would Jesus Tech, a podcast where three friends embark on a journey to reconcile their love of Jesus with technology. My name is Austin. I am the social media manager for the Gospel Coalition. I'm joined with Andrew Noble, who's in pastoral ministry at Grandview Church and currently working on a dissertation through, you said Nottingham University, Andrew? Is that right?
Nottingham, because that's pronouncing the H. You have to be all cool and local and say Nottingham.
Okay. And we're joined today with Dr. Jeff Bilbro over at Grove City College to talk about his brand new book, Words for Conviviality. I've had the pleasure of not only just working with Jeff through another organization for the past couple of years. Jeff was kind enough to come all the way out to Amarillo, Texas, in the middle of nowhere for a conference with him. It was you, Bonnie Christian, and David French, I think, were the three for that one, right? To do a conference on media literacy at my church. It was a wonderful conference, and Jeff did an amazing job at that. And I've thoroughly enjoyed reading Jeff's books over the past couple of years and getting to talk with him. And I'm super excited to talk about his new book, which, just to put all my cards on the table, I love this book. Jeff, you absolutely knocked it out of the park with this one. I love it way more than your last book, Reading the Times, which I thought very highly of, but I think you knocked this one just out of the park, and I'm excited to talk to you about it today. But why don't you take some time, Jeff, to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and intro the book that you just published, and tell us about it.
Sure. Well, thanks, Austin. Reading the Times was a fun project, but it was like a hiatus I took in the midst of writing this book, Words for Conviviality. I've been working on this one for over 10 years, and so it's very nice to have it off my computer and out into the world, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I started thinking about this right after grad school, as I was thinking about what I wanted to write after my dissertation. And I ended up writing some other things in the interim, doing some other projects. But this was always working on this in the background. I took a sabbatical in the mid-20 teens to get started and do some research. But the basic premise is looking at shifts in 19th century American media ecology due to the industrialization of printing technologies and communication technologies, and trying to discern parallels to today's digital revolution. And for a lot of reasons, which maybe we'll talk about, I think those are instructive and often neglected. People tend to focus on shifts like the invention of writing and Plato, or of course the printing press. So there are other kind of inflection points that get more attention. But I really think that the industrialization of printing and the digitization of communication with the telegraph catalyzed some very similar dynamics in American culture and politics and religion in the 19th century that we can learn from as we try to figure out how to live well as Christians in our digital age.
You do an amazing job in this book of covering multiple subjects that by themselves could be entire books in their own right, but weaving these three different subjects together to tell, or to paint one cohesive picture. You cover history, specifically U.S. history. You cover literature. You do an extensive amount of literature review in this book, showing how the writing of the time, the great American authors, how they were reacting to these changes in the technological landscape, and then talking about changes in our technological landscape today. All three of those subjects you could write an entire book on, but you somehow managed to weave all of those three things together. How did you do that?
Like I said, it took me 10 years. I mean, I did feel like, literature is my area, so that was easy. But I really felt like I had to go back and kind of teach myself media ecology and teach myself a lot of American history. And, I try to even touch on other historical shifts. So it was definitely a lot of reading and thinking over time, a lot of, months reading books, taking notes, like being in grad school again. Andrew can relate. Sometimes you don't see the fruits of these labors, but you hope they bear fruit in your own thinking in years to come. So it's a slow process, but I really felt like I couldn't tell the story I wanted to tell without at least getting a basic handle on those three disciplines and the scholarship in them.
So what would you say is that story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah.
Like what's the big picture
Yeah.
argument
So
you're making here?
I use Ivan Illich's, obviously my title is a nod to his Tools for Conviviality, but I really like his metaphor at the beginning of Tools for Conviviality. Tools for Conviviality, where he says that oftentimes the industrialization of technologies, as we go through that process, it's like crossing two watersheds. And you cross the first watershed, and there's like a marked improvement. His example is medicine. You get some basic understanding of germ theory and some basic antibiotics, and you can have really drastic improvements in healthcare that are awesome. And so people experience that, and it generates lots of enthusiasm and optimism for this new technological environment. And then as the industry becomes more professionalized, more bureaucratized, develops further, there seems to inevitably be a second watershed where the continued development of it actually leads to diminished outcomes. So you can argue about exactly when that happens in medicine, but certainly the recent debates about euthanasia or the recent debates about the costs of healthcare. I mean, the U.S. spends more on medicine for worse outcomes than
or even the reaction to the just this week, the assassination of the CEO of United Health Group.
There's so much pent up bitterness, right?
Oh yeah.
So anyway, so there's a point where things are not like the system is not helping people anymore, and I think that same thing happens with media ecology, right? So I talk about it obviously with steam-powered printing presses and the telegraph and improved communication in the 19th century. But I think you also see it today with the whiplash of sort of tech optimism versus tech pessimism. I talk about how in 2010, 2011, during the Arab Spring, Twitter was going to save democracy. Now, post 2016, Facebook's going to destroy democracy. So it happens at a very compressed timescale now. But I think that's actually is a pattern that recurs. And so I organized the book around people who were optimistic about the effects of these technologies, that they were going to empower truth and spread enlightenment and goodwill and peace.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second section is people who are pessimistic, who are concerned about being victimized by these technologies. And then the third section is, people who try to understand the good and the bad and the complexity of the trade-offs involved, but then are focused not so much on what I can do with these technologies or what these technologies will do to me, but rather, okay, given this landscape, how can I form myself and my community and others to be the kind of readers and writers who might seek truth and foster love together? So I don't have power to change the media landscape appreciably. But what can I do in my spheres of influence to cultivate the kind of readers and writers and thinkers, neighbors, who will use the tools that we have to pursue truth together?
Yeah, I really was just struck by how you did such a good job of making the past, specifically surrounding the advent of the steam printing press, and the language and the hyperbole and the optimism surrounding this innovation and all of the things it was going to do for humanity and potential and progress, and how much that mirrors much of the language and the hype and the optimism surrounding smartphones and the internet and AI. It was very illuminating just to see that while yes, there's a massive difference between the steam printing press and smartphones and AI and things like that, at the same time, we've also been here before. And that was something that, in the context of all this rapid technological change, that's a sensation I've never felt before. The idea that, like, no, actually, these kind of things have happened before in a different way, and with different results and different impacts, but the same kind of atmosphere has happened, the same kind of vibe, if you will, regarding what technology will do for our lives and for our world. That was it's hard for me to put into words just how much I appreciated that, because I feel as though at times that like we truly are living in this really uncharted territory of like humanity's never been here before. This is all brand new stuff that no one has ever thought of before. But maybe that's not actually true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is uncanny, absolutely. And I have some quotes from like Horace Greeley, who talks about, oh, the telegraph is going to make fake news go away. It's going to be
right,
impossible, right?
Yes, right.
Which is kind of like some of the early stuff about social media.
Yeah.
Or I have a quote in there from, I think, Samuel Goodrich, who's talking about how kids these days aren't reading carefully. They're just skimming and discarding. I mean, you can change the nouns a little bit, and it does feel very current. And I don't know, Austin, I mean, I tend to think of this as somewhat reassuring that, oh, yeah, the problems we face certainly have new dimensions and new characteristics, but we can draw on the wisdom of the past to face them. So I think it's reassuring, but sometimes, or it can feel like nothing new under the sun, vanity, all is vanity. We're just spinning our wheels. So I don't know. I go back and forth as to whether it's what the outcome of that is. But I do think you're right that oftentimes the similarities are greater than we expect, that we're not living in totally unprecedented times.
And even the literary examples you give of coming through literature for how writers and creatives were making use of this technology. I mean, I found some examples of that just even in my own work today as a social media manager. What you wrote about regarding, I think it was the transparent eyeball. There's an entire discipline in social media management called social listening. That is exactly what you describe with the transparent eyeball. It's uncanny how I read that, and I'm like, I literally have to do this for my job. I literally have to function as a type of transparent eyeball of sorts in operating in this space. It's a skill for any good social media manager to have. Same what you were talking about. I think it was been talking about Moby Dick. You were talking about fast fish and loose fish.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, there's so much from that as you're reading this, and especially talking about the aftermath of the election. It's like, yep, there's a lot of fast fish and loose fish to go around right now. But I know I've been kind of leading the conversation right now. Andrew, I'm dying to know, what did you think of Jeff's book?
I really enjoyed it. There's two directions that I want to go right now, and I can't go in both of them by the nature of conversation. One of them continues down this path of the difference between the digital and the print. But you just brought up the transparent eyeballs. It's whenever I start a book, I look at the chapters. And so you look at the chapters of this book and you see transparent eyeballs under the first section. There's three sections of the book: utopia, dystopia, and then the third section, which is hope, and then so you have within each one of these sections these metaphors. So transparent eyeballs, celebrities. I really enjoyed that chapter because I felt like there's a lot of celebrity talk about digital criticism, but seeing that replicated from what already occurred in print. So as a tool, you've used these metaphors, and you're drawing on Postman, who says we need metaphors. Can you just unpack the meaning of metaphors and why they were important for you to structure the book around?
Yeah, and I suppose this is also answering the question of like why does literature matter? Why should we attend to these imaginative artists, right? As opposed to just engaging in sort of arguments. So obviously, as a literature professor, this is where my bias leads me. But yeah, I think you mentioned Postman. He has this section, I think it's the beginning of Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he's riffing on McLuhan's adage, the
medium is the message. Yeah.
And he says, no, the media is the metaphor. Mm-hmm. And I love the way he unpacks that. He's talking about how as we are formed and habituated to particular media, that then shapes our whole orientation toward the world. It shapes what we expect, what we look for, how we engage one another in reality. So we sort of take on the entailments and the affordances of our dominant media. And I think that's true. And the upshot of that is, if we want to question these assumptions, if we want to try to step outside of the paradigm, the sort of metaphorical paradigm that our media impose upon us, the best way to do that is with striking different metaphors. Like, the way to think beyond the limitations of a given metaphor is with a different metaphor that's also true in some ways, that draws out other aspects of reality and recontextualizes certain aspects of the first metaphor. So that's why I think stories and poetry and literature can do for us, sort of give us alternative ways of understanding our reality that help us see things we had not before seen. And of course, as a Christian, I think this is why the prophets speak in poetry and these images, metaphors. This is why Jesus tells us parables. I think this is an ancient truth about how humans recognize reality and repent and change our patterns of life. It begins with sort of metaphors that help us recognize ourselves and then reorient ourselves to life.
So what would be your go-to metaphors for technology then? Like, because I think going into this book, one of the things that I realized is like, oh, the wolf in their pockets, Chris Martin's book.
Yep.
That metaphor has stuck with me, and I've used that with others. It's like, because a lot of people, they're like, well, the phone is just a tool. And so then they put it in this category of it's just like a garbage bin or a hammer or whatever. And then I push back on that, and I'm like, well, did you know that when you use a hammer a certain amount of time, it affects you, it changes you. If you use a shovel, it changes you. So like, there's some teaching even within using that metaphor.
True.
But the wolf is helpful because it has, instincts, and it wants to do something. It has motives. And I think that's what the Social Dilemma movie did a good job of. It like personified the company behind making the moves on social media, so that you could imagine, oh, when I'm opening up my Facebook app, I'm opening up access to some group of money hungry men to influence me so that I might buy something. Like, yeah, that's actually what's going on, and the metaphor of, money hungry men was that metaphor. So what's your kind of go-to metaphors for talking about tech?
I mean, and you just pointed out the helpfulness and limitations, I think, of those two metaphors, right? Like, there is something true about technology being a tool, in the sense that, as Ursula Franklin says, the tool shapes the task, right? The tools that we have shapes the tasks that we accomplish. So when people say it's a tool and hence it's neutral, right? There's ways you can question that, which is of course a lie. But then there's ways in which it's not a tool, hence the sort of volition behind it. But of course, and I think that the wolf is a helpful metaphor. I guess what I want to say is, like, every metaphor has things that it highlights, but also facets that it diminishes. And so we need a kind of repertoire, and not to get locked into one as like, this is the metaphor.
As paradigmatic for all things. Like,
yeah. Like, certain features are going to be better seen with certain metaphors. So that's part of why, I mean, certainly I selected the examples I did because I thought this would give us a kind of mosaic that would maybe fill in the gaps. I mean, to just mention one, I think at the beginning, I talk about Melville's line in Confidence Man, that where the wolves are killed off, the foxes increase.
That was such an excellent, like, oh my gosh, that was such a great, like, I've actually used that a couple of times. It just like, okay, we solved this problem, but that doesn't mean we're not going to face this other problem over here.
Yeah, and it's a way of naming trade-offs, right? I don't like wolves attacking me, but I don't really like foxes getting me either. So, like, yeah, maybe you get rid of sort of a central oppressive authority, but then you open yourself up to conmen and sort of sly trickster predators. So I just think so much of the discourse around media ecology wants to be kind of like here's the TED Talk, and here are the 3 things you can do to fix the problem.
Mhm.
And that's just like not congruent with the complexity of the reality we live in. So,
Amen. You
so
speak to something that's been bothering me for a while now.
I mean, it's an old human, particularly American problem. I don't know, Andrew, maybe it's a North American problem, but that we want like pragmatic solutions, and I share that desire. But hopefully, we should begin those conversations with a more nuanced understanding of the complexity, and recognizing too that and this gets back to Austin's point about how these sort of cycles recur. The fundamental problems are always in us, not in our tools, right? Like the problems in our tools are downstream of human sin. And so we have to address our own souls and our community's souls first. And that's why it sort of shifts. The first 2 sections are sort of the fears or the hopes of how this technology will enable me to gain power or be victimized. But the third one is like, what hat should I try on? What role should I try on to better form my character? So I do think sort of spiritual formation, as maybe simplistic as that sounds, is the foundational response or solution to the problems of media ecology.
Totally. No, that's well said. Yeah, I so resonate with what you're saying. I had this experience going through seminary where I thought by the end of my seminary degree, I would have all the answers to all the questions. Like I didn't actually say that out loud, but I really did think that, like, the problem of evil, I'm going to have a go-to set of answers for this. And so, yeah, moving to, again, one of the things I really appreciated about your book, I was talking to Austin about this before, is you actually spend some time unpacking what life what life could look like with a proper relationship with technology, rather than simply critiquing it, which, if I'll be honest, of the books that I've read on there's often a core critique. Here's what it's doing to us. And then there's like a final chapter of, well, it's difficult, whatever.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
And there is a challenge. Like, how do you even articulate? Like, I get invited sometimes. I want to serve these churches. They're like, can you just come for an hour and teach us for how do we use social media or how do we use tech well? And I'm like, I can't give generic advice. It is so hard, like there's so many differences of someone's capacity for virtue, their behaviors, their disposition towards the world, the metaphors they live by. There's all these pieces. But in your chapter on walkers, thinking about walking with God, walking with others, going for a walk, you mean it literally as well as, metaphorically.
Yep.
You try to give a vision for how we should live in the world. I like the idea of it, but I don't always walk without my headphones on. I literally think to myself, I've done a lot of reading on this and I know it's important. I've had various moments in my life where this has clicked for me and I see the world differently. I look at the squirrel jumping around the snow and I am in awe at this creature made by God. But then I also am walking home from my friend's house and I go, I should just run because that'll save time. And that'll be more efficient and that'll increase my exercise quota for the week. And I've kind of truncated what it means to be a human by not walking. So that's kind of me trying to live out what you talked about. How do you try to live it out? And what vision do you hope other people will live out as a result of reading that chapter, as well as kind of what you're getting at with this hopeful posture?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, you kind of named the human problem as sinners, right? We know what we ought to do and we don't do that. So I certainly share those problems. I definitely find myself writing the books that I need to read and like preaching to myself. But I do think articulating the goods of walking and talk again, both like the physical goods of walking, it slows us down. It puts us in a different relationship with the world. It gives us that kind of space where I can't be distracted in certain ways, allows me to ruminate and process. I mean, there's so much ancient wisdom that has linked physical ambulation with like certain modes of thought that do not occur when we're stationary. And there's a reason, that in the Bible, the word for Locke is like you walk it out, because you have to live out the law. It's not just a noetic intellectual assent. It's practice. So I think trying to articulate all those goods then helps me when I am trying to set up the rhythms of my life and the places where I think, oh, this would be more efficient if I cut out this habit of my life. If I drive here, it pushes me to keep those spaces in my life. But then, so this week, I walked to work on Tuesday or Monday. It was snowy here. Usually I bike to work, but I walked because it was too snowy to bike. I really enjoyed that walk. Then later in the week, I had to take my daughter somewhere. I was busy. I didn't have time. And so I drove. And I was talking to a friend of mine this morning. He's like, Jeff, I saw you driving yesterday. I can't believe you were driving. I don't always practice the things perfectly consistently. But I do think when you make an argument for some practice is good, then it helps you argue to yourself in those moments. And hopefully, the ideal, I think, is that we set up these sort of patterns in our life, and then we don't debate them. It just is what I do. And so I don't even have to think about it. I walk to church. I do this. I don't set up my phone in such a way that I can listen to things in certain conditions. So then it's never a question of, and I don't have to be tempted, I guess. I think those upstream decisions are really crucial, so that there are limits that you are placing that are hard, so that it becomes easier to do the thing that you want to do than to go for the efficiency, shut off the boredom, fill my mind with something entertaining right now route.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. I'll pass it back to Austin in a second. And one thing I'm always careful of is like, I shouldn't only talk about myself in negative ways. And the thing that I have decided to do by way of example to others, hopefully, and not being prideful, but I'm really happy with this practice, is we park the furthest from the school out of all the people who park. Our school that I take my kids to is just too far, but this regular rhythm of walking that distance to and from the school, we see the snow mountain, we call it, on the way, because it's in a parking lot and there's a snow mountain in the corner. So this week has been an awesome week of the kids just loving the snow mountain. It's like, are we going to have time after to play on the snow mountain? Yes, we will. We will make sure there's time, that we are not hurried and we can play in the snow, that you can do when you're not right close to the school. Anyways.
Yeah. That's a great example, because that's not, sure, you would love to live in a walkable neighborhood or right?
Love that.
But most are like, I just think we live.
I don't live in that. I don't live in a walkable part of the country.
You live in Texas, right? Yeah.
I would love
rural Texas.
So I just think we have to recognize, like, we don't get to live in the world that we would design, and humans have never, like, the vast majority of people, it's our experience, right? We live in a fallen world. So we have to then think, okay, how can I make do in these landscapes, whether they're virtual or physical, and sort of bend them in a more convivial, virtuous direction. And I think sometimes we can let our frustrations with reality close off our imaginations to the possibilities that exist. How easy is it? And in some ways, how easy is it, but also how hard is it, right, to park across the parking lot and make that extra work? But if you get in that habit, then it just happens. And I love that example of your kids. Looking forward to that. It's great.
Yeah, it's fun.
Jeff, I'm curious to know, what has been the response to your book so far? It's been out now for what, 3 months as of now?
Yeah, maybe. This Baylor was a great press to work with. They got my vision. It's a weird book, right? Like, it's not literary criticism.
I told Austin, it's quirky.
It's a quirky book, yeah.
I have 26 theses on textual technology. It's just a weird book. So I shopped this around to different presses, and a lot of them were like, we like this, but we want you to do this. And I was like, well, I kind of want to do this. So my editor at Baylor really got what I was trying to do and was supportive and actually helped me kind of do it better. He gave me some good suggestions that I think improved it. So happy to work with Baylor. But they're university press. They don't send out, like, advanced copies. It kind of they get it printed and then they release it. So it's been trickling out. There's been a few reviews. I've done several interviews, but I have more interviews lined up like next month. Because
Okay.
a lot of people just got the book like a few weeks after it came out, and then they got to read the thing. It's long and it's dense, so it's been slow, but it has been really gratifying. Like I've just got an email from a reader yesterday, somebody who is in the musical world, and was talking about how he read it and related it to musical recording
Okay.
and production technologies. So, so it's been gratifying so far, and I'm going to get a chance in January to teach a 3-day course at Covenant College, kind of
Okay.
on the book. So I'm really looking forward to doing that and kind of walking through these arguments with a group of 60 undergrad students, kind of seeing how they help me process it. So that should be fun.
What has there been any critique or pushback to any of your arguments in the book, or is that still, it's too early to tell
Yeah,
yet?
I don't think anyone's been like taking issue with my arguments. So that just means it's brilliant, right? I don't know. or it's a very selective audience of people who read it.
Well, the one area that I was trying to work through, and I was texting Austin about this, and I was like, Austin, I agree with you. There's a lot of similarities between the print and the digital. I'm also reading this book right now, Web of Our Own Making.
So am I.
But okay, well, you'll know in that book they are pushing, like Barba-Kay, he's pushing back on the similarities between the printing press and the digital. You can like turn to any pages. Like I have a few of them highlighted of just like, there's different things that the digital world does. One of them is the way that it adds a quantification of all things. The way of measurement that just a physical book like this, it's not going to measure words. It's just there. It's physical still. And even though it changes things from what they once were to this different mode of communication and all the things that print does, there's still so many differences to the digital world. And just one way is the quantification. It also trains attention in a totally different way. Yep. Anton talks about how it reverses the agency of the person. You go from, when you're reading a book, you are the agent over the book. You determine when your eyes move to the next paragraph. Whereas with a screen, it is inversed, that you then, you're succumb to the will of the vision in front of you. And so you're trained in a whole different way. The digital form of the digital medium, Anton argues, is just too unique. It's just too different. It can't be, and it's in some sections of the book, he makes that argument really clear. But in other sections of the book, he's like, well, here's how it builds upon the textual. Here's how it builds upon print. Exactly. So I think there is an argument to be made that it is super different, but I don't know if that's a critique against your book or just an add-on as I'm thinking it out loud. So how would you respond to that potential criticism?
That's a really thoughtful question, Andrew. And I am both, I think Barba-Kay is like he and I have corresponded. I think he's such a like incisive critic of the digital. I disagree with him at points in the book. I think he overstates the game, or I think he'll sort of paint this picture. I'm like, yeah, that's a facet, but there's other facets too. So one way you might think about art, the sort of basic difference between me and Barba-Kay is via the sort of argument that Certeau makes, Miguel de Certeau. He says, like, someone like Foucault, who's looking at the kind of top-down strategies of social control from bureaucracy or the media, is going to highlight all of the the panopticon, the power of people who are controlling the levers of our society and how oppressive that is. And sure, that there's an important narrative there. But Certeau wants to highlight the ways that users retain a lot of agency if we cultivate the creativity and imagination to use it well with one another. He talks about, like, even in things like reading or watching television, it's not just what you're reading or what you're even watching. but kind of how you are responding to it. Like the reader has a lot of, he says, readers can poach, can take things and do what they want with it. And I think the same is true of the internet. For all of its malformative affordances and the kind of dangerous orientation of a lot of the tools that we are given as consumers, there are ways that thoughtful Christians embedded in healthy communities can often adapt or adopt these tools in kind of counter methods, right? So I think we have to be careful not to overstate the determinism of the technologies that we're given.
Yep.
And recognize that there really is still agency if we recognize what's going on and think together creatively and try to cultivate these communities of kind of alternative countercultural practice. So yeah, I guess that's part of why I think there's value in looking to the past for wisdom about how to address these. One more thing I'll just say, so that's the bigger issue. But one sort of add-on, and I think Barba-Kay does not do this as much as Postman, but Postman oftentimes, I think, is overly nostalgic for the age of print.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I just think,
glad you brought this up.
I'm glad you said me too.
I mean, I like Postman, but I'm like, dude, it wasn't like in the 19th century, everyone is sitting down and reading Plato or something. I mean, people were reading pornography and sensational novels. So that's just how that's how people are. So yeah, I think we have to recognize that more people are always drawn to the bad uses of the technologies, and just trying to recover, reading long books is not going to fix human nature.
Yeah. That I think was one of the biggest takeaways that I had for the book, is that in many ways, I think it's your book, and I don't think you were intentionally trying to do this, but I think your book is a pretty devastating critique of Postman's nostalgia and the way that kind of book-ish nostalgia has kind of carried on today in people who are riffing on Postman. I mean, even my own work when I was starting out on this and really working through Amusing Ourselves to Death, I adopted that nostalgia of the world would just be better if we all just go back to reading long books.
Right.
And that's just not true. And I think in the conversations about smartphones and social media, there's been this kind of Postman-esque binary between screens and printed text, as though one is uniquely bad and the world would be a better place if we all went to the other. And that's just not true. And your book does a really good job of showing of what the world was like when all we had were books, and how people, and this is the angle I want to talk about, is mastery over textual technologies. That to me was one of the most, I think, powerful insights of the book, not only from a media ecology standpoint, but from a theological standpoint. I read Matthew Barrett's massive tome, The Reformation as Renewal, earlier this year, and the Reformation was a lot of things, but in many ways, it was a competition over mastery of textual technologies. Confessionalism, of which I'm a Presbyterian, so I'm a big fan of confessionalism, is fundamentally a mastery of a type of textual technology. And I thought that was extremely instructive for how, okay, what if our theological disagreements, or areas where different areas of the church don't align theologically, aren't necessarily theological disagreements, but actually technological disagreements. They're disagreeing on how to use these technologies in certain ways to certain ends. And so what would you say in terms of I'm trying to figure out how to form this question. It makes sense in my mind, but I don't think it's going to make sense if I just say it. What is a healthier perspective then on textual technologies, both looking at the past and textual technologies in the present, those?
I mean, I think that's right, Austin. And you can kind of go back and see the ways that, industrial print in 19th century produced problems, or the printing press and the reformational conflicts I mean, Luther is a great example of this, as somebody who got the vision for how I could use these tools to try to reform the church and then make a new church, or split off from Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
But then quickly, I mean, his stuff against the peasants is
yes,
quite intense, right? And it's because they're using his tools against him. So, and I think, one of my favorite little books on this actually is another book by Illich, In the Vineyard of the Text. And it's a quirky little book about how reading went from a communal, he calls it, the books were like a score for communal performance, that you would like read the book aloud in communal settings. And then it goes to the more individual silent reader. So as opposed to laboring in the vineyard of the text and trying to grow this crop, you're trying to appropriate it for yourself. And of course, there are some good things that come out of more focused, solitary, individualistic attention too. So I guess what I take away from this sort of long history of argumentation about textual technologies and the media that we use is that like every media has dangerous affordances, or it's going to sort of push us in ways that are unhealthy. And a healthy Christian community in particular needs to recognize that and try to sort of push against the dominant media of their day.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe in an era when all the reading is oral, you need to get away and get some solitude and think on your own. And in a time when everyone's reading silently in their books, we need to foster discourse and conversation with one another. And obviously, I talk in this book about, in a time when everyone's online, what are some things that we can do to cultivate patience, to cultivate embodiment, to cultivate healthy community. So I think rather than trying to think, if I could just recreate or create anew some perfect textual embodiment, then the word would be fully efficacious. And, our human words would be pure echoes of the divine word, and it would be awesome. But to recognize that like all textual technologies have their dangers, their temptations. And our task is to try to see those and then counterbalance them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and try to live like we got to make do, as you say.
That's
we
right.
gotta make do. We can't just rewind the clock. And there is this habit. I wasn't sure if your book was going to take this perspective before I started reading it, of like, it was just better before digital. It was better before print. And it's like, no, we got to make do with what we currently have, given the affordances that exist. And so, I try to think about that in different ways. I try to think about hope. I try to think about my own presence. I also try to think about podcasting as a different form of communication.
Yeah.
So I checked your footnotes. I was like, okay, does he talk about podcasting? And so I see that one little footnote where you talk about it positively, as some people say that podcasting is a way of going back to this kind of, but our listeners right now cannot jump in with their question, right?
Yeah.
Now, we have set up a Discord for our listeners, and maybe we should have notified them ahead of time so that they could have asked you questions, but it's not going to be live, real time. It's not going to be Socratic in the way that, Plato, is going back and forth. So,
but, Plato's readers, don't have that capacity either. And the idea is, in watching how Socrates engages in conversation, they can imitate that in their own souls and in their own communities. So I do think there's a way that podcasting could be a kind of model of conversation. I mean, we're not yelling at each other on Twitter. So,
and there's something to be said too, that like, yes, the ability to not ask questions, live in real time is a legitimate loss. And that's something that is different about podcasting from, a real conversation, happening in person, sitting at a table with an audience. But is that actually the thing that gives actually gives podcasting or conversation their power? Is the ability to ask questions in real time necessarily the thing that makes this a powerful medium for not just for information but for change and transformation and growth and learning and development. And the reason why I bring that up is because my entire seminary my entire seminary degree was online using lectures that were previously recorded. Some of them were 10 years or older. So not only could I not ask, questions of, Ligon Duncan or Scott Swain or any of these
Right.
guys in real time, there were recordings of like the students in class in that moment actually asking questions. And so you got to actually hear other students ask questions in real time. But even though I couldn't engage with my professors in that medium, it was still immensely transformative for my own life and for my own soul. The things they were saying, the teaching that they were doing wasn't real time, but was still changing me in real time. And so I wonder if like the emphasis on real time or embodied conversation is the ideal, is the standard, but is that actually the thing that transforms people at the end of the day? Or is it the spirit that works through our words and works through our ideas whenever they're heard?
I mean, faith comes by hearing, right? It's the response to the word that is so crucial and determinative, and that response does not have to be verbalized or whatever to the person who's speaking. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, just like you can read a book by someone who's been dead for 500 years and have a transformative experience, so you can hear an oral word in that same spirit of receptivity.
Yeah, I think of even Paul saying, "I'm there with you in spirit." There's something about the friendliness of his letter and the way that it would have been read and responded to. I think it brings me back to like, what is conviviality? It seems that I've often thought of podcasts as a form of friendship. There is an intimacy. We're in the ears of people right now, like there's a proximity, there's a wildness to sound. Alul talks about the wild, like the ear is the most, whatever he says, I forget the quote, but he says audio is just like, you don't know what's coming next. You don't have control. You have control of your eyes. You can close them. You can like plug your nose. You don't have to taste that thing that's in front of you, but your ears, who knows what you're going to hear next.
And Walter Ong has this long thing about like how when we speak, it's stuff coming out of the inside of our bodies, going into the inside of somebody else's body. It's like a very intimate exchange, the wave. So it's more vulnerable than sight, for sure.
So what is conviviality, and what does it mean to live convivially in a digital age?
Yeah. I mean, Illich talks about it in terms of life together, like sharing life in some meaningful way. And are our tools allowing us a kind of agency and a kind of collaboration? Or are we isolated and agonistic with one another, right? Trying to gain power over each other? And I think, given the human fall and corruption, there's always going to be this tendency to try to use whatever tools we have available to us to empower ourselves and oppress others. But like in some ways, I think one of the tasks of the church is to help us imagine how can we live with others as the body of Christ. How can we speak as members of the same body? Sort of model that for the watching world. So I think anything you can do to sort of prioritize, okay, what are words for? Many things, but in some ultimate fashion, we exchange words with one another as we are pilgrimaging toward the Word who speaks and becomes flesh to redeem us. And our exchanges are, I think, preparatory or clearing the ground for us to hear and respond to that word. So I don't think that there's like a prescription about what that means. I think it's a mystery, and there's a manifold set of practices you can do. But I do think trying to keep that the forefront and judge our daily consumption of and production of words is a healthy spiritual practice. And my hope is sort of thinking through these metaphors, like what if we use words like this? Expands our imagination of what's possible, even in an unideal media landscape, and helps us imagine how can we, in our individual lives, in our families, in our churches, in our spheres of influence at school or whatever the institutions might be, how can we cultivate a more convivial use of language with one another?
It's good.
That's really good. Well, Jeff, we're coming near to the end of our time here. If people want to connect with you and reach out to you, where can they find you? Where are you at?
Yeah, the best place is probably my website, jeffbilbro.com. My email's there, and other places that you can find me there.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, thanks for taking time out of your day. I know you're getting ready for final season, so you got a lot on your plate right now. But thanks for taking time to come on to WWJT and talk about your book. It was a wonderful conversation, and I'm thankful that you have this book done, because it means that hopefully you get to now work on something you've been sitting on for a bit.
That's right. Well, thank you so much. It's great to talk about. You guys have really pushed me to think about some of the questions here, so I'm very grateful.
Well, that's awesome. Well, listeners, thanks for joining us for this episode of WWJT. This is a listener-supported podcast. We are ad-free, and we want to stay that way, but we can't do that without your help. And so if you want to help continue making this podcast stay what it is and get even better, we could use your help on Patreon. There's a link to our Patreon in the show notes. You get some bonus perks depending upon the tier that you choose to support us at. But for anyone, Patreon supporter or not, like Andrew mentioned earlier, we do have a Discord server where you can talk to me, you can talk to Andrew, you can talk to our third host, Joel, who couldn't make it today, and talk with other like-minded believers who are also wrestling with the same questions that we're wrestling with and talking about the things that interest us in this space. Link for that is in the show notes as well. This has been another episode of WWJT. Use tech, find rest, and glorify God. We'll see y'all next time.
Take care.